Hello everybody and welcome to the first video in our short series of videos on the civil rights movement. Now this is merely a brief overview of the movement to try and let you see what has happened in the civil rights movement for African Americans. In this video we will be looking primarily at the African American experience prior to the civil rights movement. So as always, we begin with our learning outcomes. So by the end of this presentation, you guys should know what the abolitionist movement was, some of its activists, and what the Underground Railroad was. Secondly, you guys should know some of the consequences of the US Civil War. And finally, you guys should know 3 ways that some southern states tried to deny African Americans exercising their recently won rights. So, as we saw in the age of exploration, the first African slaves were being sold in large numbers when the Portuguese set up slave trading posts along the west coast of Africa, which you can see here in around the 1400s. These trading forts would have looked an awful lot like this. With the European discovery of the Americas after Columbus's voyage of 1492, there was a large demand for African slaves due to the fact that firstly, the native population of the Americas were wiped out due to European diseases such as smallpox and measles. And this was one of the reasons the Spanish were actually able to take over the Americas. The death rates of the native populations are estimated to be anywhere between as low as 50% and as high as 90%. While the Europeans' attempts at using white indentured servants also had high casualty due to diseases such as yellow fever. The West African population had a better immunity to these diseases, and therefore demand for slaves who wouldn't die as easily from diseases increased. This meant that economically it made more sense to have black slaves. This doesn't make it any less horrific, but it just explains the thinking of the slave traders at the time. This began the triangle, this tragic, disgusting, and exploitative Atlantic slave trade that would ship 12 million Africans from their homes into slavery in the Americas. It is important to note here that racism did not cause the Atlantic slave trade. The kind of racism we have seen was actually invented in the 17 and 1800s to justify keeping black Africans as slaves, even as Europeans and white Americans talked about all men being born equal. In fact, the buying of slaves hit its highest number in the United States around the time of the Declaration of Independence and the establishment of the United States. Now, slavery was banned in Europe in 1833, and this helped to inspire the abolitionist movement in the United States. So, an abolitionist is a person who wants to abolish slavery. They also called for the immediate emancipation of all slaves. To be emancipated means to be freed from restraint, control, or power of another person. Now, not all of the US allowed slavery, and many of the states in the north of the country were known as free states, while those in the south depended on slaves for their economy. The abolitionists set up an underground railway, which was a network of people offering shelter and aid to escaped slaves from the south. Now, people such as Frederick Douglass, who we met when we met Daniel O'Connell, wrote a book called An American Slave describing his experience, and this raised awareness of the harrowing life that slaves lived. And also people like this, Harriet Tubman, who became one of the most famous conductors of the Underground Railway, as they were known, helped inspire the call for abolition with her powerful words and actions. Some of the things she said: I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. She also said, if you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. Keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. These tensions eventually led to a civil war breaking out in the United States in 1861. You guys remember that a civil war is a war between citizens of the same country. The South wanted greater freedom and to keep slavery legal, while the North wanted to abolish slavery and keep the United States one united country. Abraham Lincoln was the president when the Civil War broke out, and in 1863 he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which called for all slaves in areas of rebellion to be free. The North won the war in 1865, and the Emancipation Proclamation paved the way for the permanent abolition of slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment was passed in 1865 and officially abolished slavery in the United States. However, the civil rights movement begins nearly 100 years later, looking for equality. So, what happens in the 100 years between emancipation and the civil rights movement? Well, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. He was shot dead by a man called John Wilkes Booth. He was replaced by Vice President Andrew Johnson, who didn't push forward with Lincoln's ideas of reconstructing society in the United States and giving the freed slaves an opportunity to build a life for themselves. However, some politicians continue to push through legislation like the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed all citizens the equal protection under the laws. They also forced through the 15th Amendment in 1869, which granted African American men the right to vote. While there was initial optimism that some form of change might happen with the election of people like Herm Rhodes Revels, the first African American and Native American senator elected in 1870, and Blanche Bruce, the second black senator being elected, and also the first ex-slave being elected in 1881, black Americans' participation in government came to a screeching halt. In fact, there would not be another black senator until 1967. That would be the third black senator. And Barack Obama was only the fifth ever black person to be elected senator in America. So how did this happen? What did they do to make sure that African Americans didn't participate in politics? Intimidation tactics became a big one. This is where the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan came along and other white supremacist groups, and they began to attack politicians who supported black rights, and they attacked African Americans who challenged any white authority. The KKK tactics worked, intimidating people into voting for white supremacist politicians in the South, which brought an end to this push for a reconstruction of American society by 1876. There was also an attempt to re-enslave the black population with the introduction of the Black Code, which allowed southern states to arrest black people for the smallest of misdemeanors. So, for example, several states made it illegal for a black man to change jobs without the approval of his employer. Southern states also began to introduce something called the Convict Leasing scheme. They took advantage of the 13th Amendment, which allowed you to almost enslave a man again if he was found guilty of a crime. And states began to lease these convicts, primarily these African Americans who were being victimized, and they were being leased back to the plantations and other facilities that were seeking labor, as the freed slaves were now trying to withdraw and work for themselves. The criminal justice system worked with plantation owners and other businesses to entrap, convict, and lease black people as prison labourers. Eventually, the public outcry led to the replacement of the convict leasing system by something called the chain gangs. And the chain gang system was brought about because there were massive complaints in the South about the poor road system that was costing people profits. So they decided again to use cheap labour, or what was in fact slave labour. Prisoners were brought outside, the prisoners were shackled to one another and forced to do tough labour, and were worked under gunpoint and under whips. 95% of people on the chain gangs were black, which goes to show you exactly what the agenda of this system was. So we then see one of the other things that is used to intimidate black Americans, and this is this horrible act of lynchings, where people would be attacked by mobs, and these lynchings of black people rose significantly between 1890 and 1920s and terrified the African American population. So in our next video, we will look at the Jim Crow laws and the beginning of the civil rights movement and how it evolves. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now, you guys should know what the abolitionist movement was. You guys should know some of its activists and what the Underground Railroad was. You guys should know some of the consequences of the US Civil War. And finally, you guys should know 3 ways that some southern states tried to deny African Americans exercising their rights. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.